Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of Sunday Messages. And we are changing themes this month. So, as you know, last month I did the money series. I have decided that this month I'm going to be focusing on topics that kind of revolve around the overall idea of consumption. And the reason being is that Apex has opened up once again, which is my most intensive mastermind. It's my most intensive program that I offer. And one of the most important elements of it is the consumption fast that you're in during that first 6-week period of time. And let me just tell you, if you have not been on a consumption fast, it is a trip. It is wild to go on a consumption fast. So I'm probably going to take this in a couple different directions. I plan on talking about the side effects or the symptoms of overconsumption. And then I also want to talk about the mechanical pieces, the energetic pieces of what's happening when you're overconsuming. And I think I'm going to do this on a different episode, but it kind of dovetails with today's conversation, which is numbing. So I'm going to do another episode all about numbing behaviors, it goes hand in hand with consumption. So that's kind of the vibe of what we're going to be focusing on in April. A couple things I want to remind you of. Those of you who want to join Apex, we start May 1st. And for those of you who don't know, I actually created Apex because it was what I wanted. I needed Apex. I wanted Apex. I wanted to see what would happen when I set myself up to get into absolute peak performance, absolute top-notch condition. I wanted to see what would actually happen to my life when I started conditioning myself emotionally, mentally, spiritually in the way that I would train for the Olympics. So I refer to Apex as it's the Olympian level training for your energetic body, because that's how I've designed it, is to get yourself into peak performance. And after I ran myself through it the first time, not only did I make some tweaks and modifications to make it easier to take other people through, but this has actually become what I am now aiming at on a more regular basis. So when I'm thinking about when do I feel my best, Apex is actually what I compare it to. Let me just tell you, it is a major reset button. So if you feel the call, if your soul is pinging you, if you're like, yes, that is what I want, that is what I desire, I want to experience myself in my peak performance, Apex is where you ought to be. So again, we start May 1st. Hop in if you feel the call, and I will see you inside that container. Now, the other thing that I have out right now is called Fabric of the Universe. This is a masterclass that is all about the quantum field, and this one is free. So it's a 3-day masterclass. We're going to be together next Monday, Wednesday, Friday, so the 11th, 13th, and 15th of April. And then I have a Q&A the following week. So this one is very dense, and this is also a masterclass where I feel that my natural talents are actually going to really shine in this masterclass. So I'm really excited to put this on. And that one is going to be free for a limited time. You guys know how I do things. It's a free masterclass. Get it while it's hot, and then it is going to become a paid offer later on. So if you are feeling the call to learn more about the quantum field, really understand energetics and harmonics and all of the fun, nitty-gritty details and deep dive on all things quantum field. So because it is so dense, I'm actually reserving a whole separate day for the Q&A because it is going to be meaty lectures, just so you know. So prepare yourselves, grab a notebook, grab a pen. It is going to be that kind of chat. So I'm very excited to have all of you in there. And as always, the links will be in the show notes, description box, wherever you're listening to this, you will have the links. And if you're on my newsletter, you'll see them pop up in there as well. And let's go ahead and dive into this. So the first thing that I want to discuss when it comes to consumption is the energetics of what is happening when you're consuming. So for the sake of this, initial example that I'm going to be giving, we're explicitly going to focus on the mind. This isn't always where consumption comes from, right? Like you could also be consuming alcohol. That's a whole different energetic process that's happening. So let's just focus on something like television, books, podcasts, like anything that you consume in terms of information or even communicating with a friend, things like that. So you're going to imagine that around your head or around your crown, it's like a clear bubble. So in your purest state, you can imagine that from up above your crown, you receive information, inspiration, your sense of knowing, your sense of truth. All of this pure information comes from up above your crown. We could say it's your connection to God, your connection to your soul. And inside this clear bubble, let's imagine that there's all of this beautiful gold light or mist or however you want to imagine it that you're now plugged into. You now have access to all of this information that is divinely available for you and you alone. So at this point, I would describe you as being in your most natural state, right? So it's your inspiration, your truth, your information, your sense of knowing, all of your stuff, your divine connection to your divine source. That's it. That's the only thing that is happening here. Now, when external earth side information, okay, let's keep it as broad and general as that. External earth side information. So this is all of the stuff from other people, including this podcast, right? Because this is external earth side information. Now, instead of that golden deliciousness that would normally be accessible to you, that nectar that you kind of want to be coming through to you from your divine source, now, when you start consuming other things, there's other colors that are in the mix. And if you're not highly discerning about what it is that you're inviting into your crown, it can actually really clutter your field. So let's say you read an article that scares you or makes you feel or imagine things that carry the energy of doom. Then you can imagine in that bubble around your crown, there's going to be this dark smoke or ink-colored substance that is now interfering with that information that you would normally have access to, right? So that gold information, that liquid gold, liquid love, divine, holy information that you really want to be connected to on a regular and consistent basis, now is getting external interference from the other stuff that you're consuming. And I'm sure you've had that experience where you're fine, you're feeling amazing, and then you read something or talk to someone or hear something or walk past a television, or there's something else that comes into your space that knocks you off your game. Now, if you don't have rock solid discernment, if you are not so anchored into your truth that you are unshakable, you are going to be more easily swayed by consumption. And just like anything else, I really think this comes down to how practiced are you at this as a skill. So it's not just about never expose yourself or never consume. That wouldn't be any fun, right? Not experiencing other people's creations or enjoying other people's art. We end up missing out on a lot of the fun stuff that comes along with being around other people. However, when you're not bringing the consciousness piece to the consumption, that's where people often get swept away. And so if there's mindlessness that's in the mix in conjunction with consumption, then you kind of have a clusterfuck going on, where you stop being able to really feel your own truth and have a good sense of what is right for you, because there's too many other elements that are in the mix. And if you're not sensitive to the consumption piece, or even when you feel like you're about to overconsume, when you're on the edge of overconsuming, right? Because it's not that consumption is bad, it's the overdoing it piece that can make things more complicated. So the first skill to develop in all of this would be discernment. Are you discerning what is truth from lie for you as you're filtering it through your crown? So when you're thinking of your crown chakra, if you will, that energetic center, it's a big filter. It's an informational and energetic filter where you're filtering through and discerning right at the crown. So some people have really, really strong crowns where it's like you cannot bullshit me, right? And then you have people who are very easily open and receptive to a lot of different information. Neither one is good or bad, right? In the extremes, they can both come with different kinds of problems, but you get the gist that there is a balance there. The second piece would be understanding, okay, did I overconsume? Is this actually my truth? And then actually being able to kind of come down from all of that information, find your center, find your truth again, and then move forward from that space of just having your field really clean. So when it comes to consumption, in my opinion, I think about consumption kind of like what you're putting in the attic. Now, if you're just putting any old thing in the attic, you're gonna have a problem, right? There's mice have developed a home up there. They're making themselves nice and cozy. You have boxes and boxes of stuff. You don't even know what's in those boxes anymore. And keep in mind, the more your attic is full of God knows what, dusty, crusty stuff, the less room and space you're actually going to have for all of that divine light that we talked about in the beginning, which that really is where your compass comes from. Your compass comes from your source. That's the purest, most reliable place for you to move from. Make any decisions, make any moves, make any modifications, put anything out into the world. You want to actually have access to that unique information that is ready and available for you. So let me give you a really good example of what overconsumption looks like generally in what I see a lot of the time. Is let's say you get an idea, and instead of moving with the idea or the inspiration that you had, you decide to go on YouTube and start looking up how-tos. Now let's use knitting as an example for this. Let's say you get the inspiration like, ooh, I want to pick up knitting. So you go and initially start looking up how to cast the first stitches, okay? But then you get sucked into the consumption of information and you go down a rabbit hole, and now all of a sudden you're watching YouTube videos on different types of yarn and different types of needles and different styles of socks and all these different things that are 80,000 steps ahead of you, and you haven't even picked up a ball of yarn yet. But the consumption has just taken you full force to the point where now you're exhausted. You haven't done anything. You've only been consuming, but you're so full of information that now the inspiration is gone. Your original sense of purpose is completely gone. And there's been this burnout that has already occurred through this overconsumption. Let me add one thing here because it's relevant. Keep in mind, we are only humans who are trying to adjust and learn and evolve with the technology that we have at our disposal. So when I'm describing this to you, I'm able to describe it really well because I've done it. And I would say any human who has the amount of information and technology that we have is going to be prone to overconsumption at some point. And the thing is, when it comes to consumption goes far, far, far beyond technology, obviously. That's just the easiest one that is the most relatable for the most people. You can overconsume good things. You can overconsume anything. You can overconsume, and this is something that I learned in Apex, you can overconsume books. You can overconsume music. You can overconsume pretty much anything. And that was the really interesting thing about the very first time I did an intensive consumption fast, was realizing, holy shit, I had no clue how much stuff fell into the category of consumption. Here's another good example of one of the symptoms that I've experienced in overconsuming, particularly when it's on the phone. So whether it be Instagram, TikTok, even podcasts can do this a lot, depending on what kind of podcast you're listening to. But one of the sensations that I noticed was this desire to Google things. So I would come out of consuming and then feel like I need to Google a whole bunch of stuff, which was a really interesting thing that I just observed within myself. And I'm like, oh, this only happens in this very narrow context of when I'm specifically on these kinds of apps or listening to this kind of podcast, that I feel this drive to go look more things up. And the thing is, if you're not used to intentionally carving out space, consumption often breeds more consumption. So it really is magnetic for just more and more and more consumption. Now, let me take this in a different direction for a moment. So I don't know if this is still occurring, but one of the things that I was seeing a lot of was, if you're on like ADD or ADHD TikTok, you probably know what I'm talking about, where people will just rattle off a whole bunch of ADHD symptoms, okay? And obviously, because this isn't the whole picture, there were a lot of people who kind of glommed on to a very limited, brief 15-second clip and would start self-diagnosing because there seemed to be some overlap between ADHD and whatever it is that's going on with them. Now, I would see, this was happening to me last year. I would see some of these videos that would irritate me to high hell. And part of the reason that they would irritate me so much is because I actually shared a lot of those symptoms, but I knew I didn't have ADHD. So I kept thinking to myself, if I did not have the level of discernment that I do about my own body and the well-being and the functioning of my own body, I could fall for that trap. I could take that bait and start actually making this a part of my personal identity, and it could really cause a problem. Like, over-identifying with symptoms that you're experiencing is actually dangerous in a lot of ways. And so that's one of the reasons it kind of became this thorn in my side every time that I would see these things pop up online. And let me tell you, as soon as I did my first, I would say, week of the consumption fast, the very first time I did that, there was a severe reduction in all of those things that were in that TikTok where I was like, well, I have that, and that, even though I know I don't have ADHD, but all of those things would disappear with a consumption fast. So then I started putting two and two together where I'm like, there is something about technology. And if you know Andrew Huberman, he's a neuroscientist up in Northern California, but he does a lot of research on hormones, different neurotransmitters, and he's also done a lot of research on dopamine. And the interesting thing about dopamine that I don't know if he discovered this, but there was something in the literature or the research that he personally did that kind of revealed this about dopamine, is people used to consider dopamine to be like the reward neurotransmitter. And that was actually wrong. as it turns out, dopamine has more to do with wanting, craving, desiring, pursuing things. So that feeling like you want to get, that's where dopamine comes into play. When you actually get there, your dopamine tanks because the chase is over, the hunt is over. The desire part is completely over because you already got the thing. So one of the things that I really started to experience during my first hardcore consumption fast was a shocking amount of dopamine. My dopamine went through the roof when I went on this consumption fast. My productivity shot through the roof. My ability to get things done and make things happen went through the roof because there wasn't a constant sense of reward that was occurring through consumption. So when you are on a TikTok scroll hole or an Instagram scroll hole, think about it like reward, 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 right? It's very satisfying to the brain. And because there's nothing to pursue, it tanks your dopamine. So you're getting all of these little hits a whole bunch of times, consume, consume, consume. Your dopamine is getting lower and lower and lower because there's no buildup. There's no chasing that's occurring. There's no desire or wanting or craving that's happening. And so your dopamine tank never fills back up. The more you consume, the less dopamine that you have because you're constantly giving your brain this sense of reward. And the more rewards you get, the less dopamine you're going to have. And this was the big breakthrough that I personally had when I did my first consumption fast. And it was funny because initially I discovered this on my own. I could feel what was happening in my body, even though I didn't have the neuroscience language to describe what was happening on this level that I just mapped it out for you. But then I heard this description after the fact and I put everything together. I was like, aha, that's it. That's exactly what's going on with this. The other thing that was really interesting for me is, well, let me just throw this out there. The most interesting thing about going on a consumption fast is realizing and recognizing that there is going to be a point in which you do overconsume and you just feel it really intensely. So, of course, during a consumption fast, it doesn't mean that you will have zero input. That's literally impossible for you to have zero input. So the idea of a consumption fast is fast as much as you possibly can with the understanding that there are going to be things where and times where you do have input. So navigating that is what we do in Apex. But one of the things that I allow or I permit during the protocol is books. Okay, so because I was following my own protocol, I was reading books. And of course, there was one day where I overconsumed reading. And I read for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours. I finished a whole bunch of books in one day. And by the end of the day, I had read so much that I felt drunk and unsatisfied and nothing sounded good. Nothing sounded good. Reading another book didn't sound good. Working didn't sound good. Cooking didn't sound good. Absolutely nothing sounded good because my dopamine was completely tanked. And what I discovered for myself was that the neurotransmitter that makes me do shit is dopamine. The thing that makes me get after it and get out of bed in the morning and actually go do things is dopamine. And I had no clue how critical that was and what was happening in certain consumption habits. And I wouldn't even consider myself to be necessarily unconscious with my phone. And just keep in mind that I consider myself to have pretty good boundaries with my phone just on a regular and consistent basis. Like I am conscious of what is happening with my phone, but that does not mean that I'm not susceptible to overconsumption. Now, the thing that I think disturbing is too strong of a word, but something that has become very apparent to me over time is how subtle consumption can really be when it comes to your belief systems. So I consider myself to have really, really high levels of discernment. I've been in practice for a really long time with all of that, obviously given my background. So discernment was really easy for me. It was easy for me to call bullshit from a really young age. And so that helps in terms of having a really developed crown. But one of the things that I've noticed, mostly through observing other people and then also through being exposed to things myself, is how quickly the consumption to belief pipeline really is. There are so many things that people ingest, accept as truth, drop their creatorship completely in the process, and then just turn whatever they've consumed into a belief. And it happens rapidly. Part of this has to do with the volume, like the volume of content and information that's available. People are not slowing down enough to really filter out the noise and really decide, am I accepting this as true? Do I want this to be true? Should it go in the belief pile? Instead, the consumption is just happening so quickly that it goes from that, consume belief, consume belief, consume belief. And to me, it's like, well, if you're going to maintain a really strong sense of creatorship, you can't be doing that. You can't be doing that. Not to say that getting into an Instagram scroll hole should be condemned. Of course, I'm not going to do that. But the point of this is that you really want to understand that when you are in consumption mode, which we all do, of course, it's fun to watch a movie and consume someone's art or listen to really good music. Like, there isn't anything inherently wrong with consumption itself because we like doing it. However, there needs to be awareness, or rather, my goal here is to bring awareness to the fact that when you are in consumption mode, you are no longer in intentional creatorship mode. Those are two different things that cannot coexist at the same time. Even if I were to say, okay, I'm going to listen to you first, I'm going to have you present this thing to me, then I'm going to have to filter it through my crown, decide for myself truth or a lie. Then and only then can I toggle back into creatorship mode and then start creating from there. But as long as there is an input happening, creatorship is going to be on the back burner for a moment. So, the big takeaway message from this episode that I really want to land here is that if you want to have a full creation experience, if you want it to be full and robust, you need to have space in order to do that. There needs to be space for quieting the mind. There needs to be space for contemplation. There needs to be space for decision making. There just needs to be more space in general. And that's something that I feel for so many people has been lost and not prioritized or valued in the way that it really should be. Because only in that space where you're not in consumption mode, where you're not hunting, you're not seeking and trying to satisfy that temporary drive to just fill a void, which is what the Instagram scroll hole is really doing. When you're out of that, when you give yourself adequate space to fully come down from the discomfort of having the empty space, because what I can tell you right now, some of you are thinking, oh, no, I'm so good at this. I have lots of empty space. But you're listening to podcasts when you're in that empty space, or yeah, you're taking a bath, but you're listening to an audiobook, or yeah, you're doing this, that, and the other thing, but you're filling it with music. And the reason why I feel so strongly about this is because I feel like there's a great deal of potential that's being lost to this simple issue of overconsumption. And like I mentioned before, all of that stuff that you don't want to do, or that you're spending more time in thought and consumption and digestion than you are in actually making moves, could just be a simple dopamine issue. What if it was your dopamine tank is empty because you haven't let it reset, because you're filling your brain or giving your brain the impression that it's already received the reward. Every time you watch a YouTube video, you're getting a reward. Every time you're scrolling on Instagram, reward, reward, reward. Or like Andrew Huberman described it as context changes. When you're going through all these context changes on Instagram or TikTok, what do you think is going to happen? What else are you actually going to be able to find satisfying and nourishing if that's what you're giving your brain the impression is a proper reward? Everything else is just going to feel so dull and lackluster in comparison to the sheer volume and novelty that you've been feeding your brain for so long. And by for so long, it could be something like an hour. An hour could totally tank you and drain you. So the reason why I feel strongly about this is because there are projects that you want to get done. There are things that you want to make happen. There's things to put into the world, right? And without proper prioritizing of what it is that you're digesting and what you're consuming, you're filling your attic with shit. And it just makes it way more complicated to feel your own compass, right? Because there's so much other stuff in the mix. There's so much clutter. There is so much debris hanging out in your energetic field that your compass really struggles to work properly. Now, I'll give you a little piece of homework if you really want it. I would just invite you to experiment with this. And what you're going to do is you are going to pick a time or a place or window when you would normally consume something, and you're going to not consume, and you're going to let it be open space. So maybe that's when you're cooking a meal, or maybe that's within the first hour of your day, or maybe it's when you get in the bath. Pick a window when you normally really love consuming something and don't consume, and see what happens. Now, I tell you this with absolute knowing from my own experience that things have a different kind of luster when you shift out of overconsumption. When that is no longer in the picture, things become much more gratifying, much more satisfying. And this was the other thing that I found really interesting about my first, hardcore consumption fast, was my personal experience with productivity really changed. Because when the consumption piece is no longer in the mix, your perception of time changes. Your understanding of how long something actually takes is very, very different. But when you are consuming a lot, time kind of dies unless you're using it intentionally. So if you are being deliberate with consumption and you're not doing it from an unconscious space, your experience of time in that consciousness is very different. So what that might look like is laying on the couch and watching 8 hours of TV because you're just in a consumption hole is very different from going on a date with your partner and watching a movie, or watching a special movie with your kids for the first time. Two wildly different experiences, right? And the difference being that intentionality and consciousness that you're bringing to the activity. And therefore, your experience of the time is going to shift as well. So on a consumption fast, your perception of time radically changes like no other, particularly when you're doing a long consumption fast. So like I said, the consumption fast that I did during the last Apex was 8 weeks. I'm shifting it to 6 weeks, and then the last 2 weeks are going to be reintegration with consuming, because I realize that's where it can get a little bit rocky when you're trying to reintroduce consumption after a long fast. But anyway, I digress. You will experience time in a way you never have before when you're on a consumption fast. It's insane. It is unbelievable. I've never felt anything like it. I felt like I gained 50 years in a 2-month period of time. So that is the homework. Let me bring this back to the homework, is pick a window where you would normally consume and don't, whether it be music, podcasts, audiobook, looking at Instagram, looking at TikTok, anything of the sort. See what happens. And another piece to keep in mind is what happens to your experience of time in that window. Because I guarantee you it's going to feel a lot longer. Now, of course, I'm not going to recommend this for those of you who are going to the DMV. You don't necessarily want to have your time expand when you're doing something like waiting in line at the DMV. I'm not I'm not suggesting that, but you get the idea. Something that is habitual every day. See what happens when you don't consume during that period of time, and watch what happens to the time that you have. That is all that I have for you today, my loves. Once again, if you want to get an Apex, experience your full potential, catapult yourself into a completely different reality, apply. We start May 1st. If you want to get into Fabric of the Universe, it's a free masterclass that I have going on right now, all about the quantum field. Go sign up. Both of the links are in the description box or the show notes. I will see you there. I appreciate you all so much. Thank you for hanging out with me. I will talk to you later. Have a good one, everybody. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.